Welcome to another inspiring conversation with an inspiring or amazing leader. My name is Marc Pitman. I'm the author of The Surprising Gift of Doubt. Oh, I almost got it on the first try. And instead of just refreshing sales pages and wondering if people are buying the book, my wife recommended I talk to people I enjoy and that inspire me, leaders that are doing really cool things. And so that's what we're doing for these 2 days. And at this point, I get to introduce you to Christina Blacken. Christina is somebody who I love how you bring your full self to what you do. And I love your models, the narrative intelligence and all, but there's, your podcast, Sway Them With Color. I mean, I just love that you are yourself. You have learned to own yourself and be yourself. And I think you're freeing up a lot of other people. For people who don't know Christina, she is the founder of The New Quo, which is a leadership development and inclusion consultancy. She's been a speaker. She's a performer. She's coached over 1,500 Fortune 500 companies and VC backed startups. She's doing the stuff. She knows her stuff. And Christina, it is an honor to have you here today. Thank you for saying yes.
Well, thank you for such a lovely intro. And also the graphics that opened up on this, impress. That was my level. I'm like, this is pretty impressive.
I could hook you up. It was my daughter who mods for Twitch, connected me with the person who did that. And we just got him at amazing. 90 minutes before the first interview today.
Well, look at that Hail Mary. It came through.
Yeah, exactly. You got the Stream Deck going, get the eCam going. So, the lower thirds. So, yeah, thank you, Christina. No, I would love to, there's so much I'd love to unpack about growing up in Utah and some of the stories you've shared on your podcast and all. But for people that are listening, the white paper you did on narrative intelligence and leadership and just thinking of leadership differently is incredibly important. And I was wondering, would you be able to introduce us to what narrative intelligence is and what how a leader might orient around that instead?
Yes. So narrative intelligence, although it's an awesome term, I did not coin it.
Okay.
It was first developed in, I think, the 1970s by artificial intelligence researchers, because they were trying to figure out how do we get algorithms and robots and machines to operate like human beings and like human brains, because our brains organize information in narrative. So from the age of about 3 years old, most people start telling stories. I mean, you've seen a 3-year-old who's like, the red ball and the alien and the dinosaur. You're like, what are you talking about? But it's because their brain is really trying to organize information in a way that could be stored, remembered, and also help them make decisions in the future. So narrative intelligence is sort of your ability to organize information in the world and changes events around you into a narrative format, and also the ability to then construct narratives to influence someone else's thinking or behavior. So the irony of that is you're doing it all the time. Most people are telling stories, whether it's for connection, entertainment, persuasion, on a daily, minute-to-minute basis with your friends, your homies, your colleagues, your lovers, you name it. And we're not really conscious of it, which is why I think narrative intelligence is not only about the ability, but also your awareness of how narrative and story affects belief, bias, and behavior.
Wow. I love that you said that we're doing it all the time already. Why do you think that something that we do so naturally is something that so many leaders just artificially cut out of their life?
I think because we're conditioned to stop being as creative as we naturally are as human beings. I think by the age of 13, creativity plummets. And it's not because you don't have the ability. We're taught and sort of conditioned in pretty traditional or educational structures that that's something you shouldn't do unless you're like a Jay-Z or a Picasso, sort of like a crazy talented celeb-based person, to pursue something that feels more creative or more art-based or whatever you name it. And so we're kind of, it's kind of beaten out of us a little bit. And I think once you are in a certain structure, especially as a leader, a lot of leaders believe you have to operate and communicate in a certain way. And so they stop telling stories that are open, that are vulnerable, that are personable, because they feel like it's not business and that it isn't as serious or as impressionable or as impactful. And that's absolutely not true. Some of the most really impactful leaders in the world have been great storytellers, for better or for worse. There are people we've seen in this last year, for example, with some of the false news and terrible stories on social. Narrative in and of itself drove people to believe in conspiracy theories. Narrative, drove people to go to an insurrection. Like, there's lots of reasons why story has such incredible power, for good or for bad. But that's the great thing about it. I think it's something that can be improved upon, and people can become better at it, just like emotional intelligence. We know that we have emotions. Most people
Hmm.
aren't cognizant of them or how to control them. And that term has become more popular for leaders, right? Because they know that emotional intelligence is important. I think narrative intelligence will start to have that sort of understanding as well.
So, what do you think? How are there ways that you, as you're approaching, somebody comes to you and says, "I need to get a more engaged workforce. I need to increase productivity. I need to whatever." What are some of the ways that are would they have you found that are easier entrance points to have them think of this new, not new, but new to them, narrative intelligence?
Well, one of the things I do in my story coaching is I do coaching for leaders at large companies and also just one on one. And a lot of it is narrative inquiry, which is the process of self reflection. So it's sort of unpacking your own
Hmm.
life story, your career story, and really understanding what are your values, what is driving the work that you do, and also taking small anecdotes from your personal life and using that as a narrative framework for the ideas that you want to share with your colleagues or your clients. So, an example of that is I worked with someone recently who just stepped into a pretty large marketing role at a tech company. And she was pretty much tasked with this huge change management project where the team was really struggling. They weren't hitting certain goals. They didn't have a lot of buy in or excitement. There wasn't really clarity on purpose or development there. And she wanted to come up with an entire new sort of goal setting framework and employee development program. And so I helped her to excavate her personal experiences and to drill
Hmm.
down into something called collaborative intelligence, which was this excitement around team building, strength identification, and aligning people on a singular goal. And so we found her kind of what I call theory of change, which is what is exciting to her when it comes to solving a problem and what's her unique way of doing it. And then we used her personal life stories. She was a competitive ice skater for many years. And so we talked about her experiences
Wow.
of collaborative intelligence from ice skating into the boardroom. And she said it went off without a hitch. Like she was able to make a deeper connection, to get more buy-in and trust, and to make people understand and buy into this new idea of how the team could work towards their fullest potential and how the organization can reach its fullest potential. And so I think small tweaks
Wow.
in self-awareness and making a connection between the past and the present is a powerful first step for most leaders to understand how to use story to influence people.
And it totally feels like it's, in my experience in coaching leaders too, that it feels almost like they're being irresponsible if they take time to reflect or to have some self awareness. Or what I love about what you're saying is she never will lose that because those are her stories. So she's not going to have to remember what was the 7 habits or the 36 things or the 15 intentions. It's her. So that you've released her to
Absolutely.
be herself more authentically. But I have seen over my years that sometimes the self-referential stories can become really toxic, and they're not necessarily freeing. So, are there ways that people can? Is there a way to avoid it from becoming a well? Back when I was, when I was a kid.
Absolutely. That's why I think it's important of knowing what the need is of your audience and
Hmm.
how the story can help to illuminate some serving that need or providing a solution to them. Because it all should be focused on who's the audience, what are you trying to say to them and why, and what are their problems, and how can you address their problems. So if you talk from that perspective, no matter what you do, whether it's sharing a story or just, doing a presentation, it'll have much more of an impact instead of being the sort of, self-appreciating kind of like, I'm so self-important. It's very different to be able to talk about
Yeah.
a story that makes sense and gives an anecdote to an idea. And I think that's the fear people had. That's actually the fear this woman I just mentioned had. But she's like, is this going to be weird if I'm like talking about myself? I'm like, no. If you think about it, when you are in conversation with people and they really get to know you, they want to know your story. And that's just on, if you don't know anything about the people around you, you'd be like, I don't know those people. I want to know their stories beyond the surface. What motivates them? What are they excited about? Why are they doing what they're doing? And being able to even give a tiny little bit of an opening to that allows you to be a more effective leader. People feel like they see who you are and what you stand for and what you want to do instead of just being somebody who barks orders or micromanages people, which is what people usually default into when it comes to leadership. So I think that's important. Another thing I wanted to mention, because you brought up authenticity, is I think one reason why my work has been so successful is I do tie a lot of my story into my work because my work was motivated from my early experiences and my experiences in corporate America. And if I didn't have that, I don't think people would resonate with it as much. If
Hmm.
I separated all of my personal story from my work, they probably wouldn't buy into it as much or understand it as much. And so I see that as sort of an
Interesting.
opportunity for connection, not necessarily just being self important.
Well, Kate, our friend Kate O'Neill, said that maybe the next book could be The Surprising Gift of Narrative Intelligence.
Really great title, Kay. I might have to write that down.
Yeah, you could go for that one. I'll let you own that all. You're, that's awesome. Um, so tell me some about your own story then. What were you didn't just probably come out of college or high school or whatever ready for narrative intelligence. What were some of the things that brought you to understanding this kind of leadership?
I think it started pretty young because I learned very early that people will create entire belief systems based solely on narrative. We're not necessarily on direct experience. So I would see that, for example, in my community was predominantly Mormon. So most people were raised in the Mormon religion or they were born into it. And for a long time, there were specific texts within the Mormon teachings around people of color that were pretty racist. But you can Google it. There's lots of information
Yeah.
about this. So until 1978, people of color couldn't have a position of leadership in the church. Now, semantics, be like, we don't hate the blacks. We just don't want them in power, right? So people are like, well, that's what it meant. But it taught people very clearly that power, visibility, having a voice has to look a very specific way. And so, because of that narrative and those stories that people learned in the religious institutions, it translated into the communities pretty pervasively. My experiences in school and with institutions around me were very clearly, very distinctly racist in certain ways. And I do think that narrative aspect of teaching what does power look like and what it should it look like was incredibly impactful in my community, even though there really weren't even that many people of color to then base it off of. It was solely based on this narrative and the story that they learned through religion. And that's just one aspect. Obviously, people learn bias through family and through all of these other places. And the Mormon Church has now since, removed those sort of teachings, but the impact and the history is still there. And so I learned that very early. I was like, wow, you're not around those kinds of people, but you still have such a distinct opinion and belief about people you've never interacted with. And so from there, I just started to really dig into story, and I loved writing as a kid. And eventually, as I got older, I got into positions that were storytelling driven. So marketing, campaign building. I was in the nonprofit world for a number of years and would build campaigns and get teens to get off the couch and get involved in social issues through text messaging, through SMS campaigns, through gamification campaigns. So I was like, this is some powerful stuff. I would make a story and I, put some facts into education in it, and people do things. So how do we use this tool for good and not just to sell people stuff that they don't need, or, convince them to do things that may not be that good or impactful?
Wow. So Utah, growing up in Utah, when did you move to? Was it when you went to college? When did you?
Yes.
Because you're now in the Northeast, right?
Yeah, I'm in New York City now. I moved to New York for college. And the funny thing is I had someone in my church, because I was in the Baptist church at the time. I no longer participate in organized church. But then it was a preacher who was like, hey, did you hear about this program? It's called LEAD, which was for minority students who wanted to potentially be exposed to schools that they wouldn't have access to. And I was like, I haven't heard of it, but sure, I'll look into it. Because she's like, I think you would be great in this. I think you should apply. So I waited till the very last day, like the very, very last day of the deadline, and submitted an application. And I ended up getting accepted into this summer program my junior year of high school that was at Cornell University. And I didn't know anything about Cornell at the time, because especially on the West Coast, there's not a lot of talk about like this sort of old school, like Ivy League system of schools. It's not really a big thing. I think on the East Coast, it's obviously something people talk about from a very young age, and it's kind of in their radar. It wasn't in mine. So I was like, oh, this is going to be a cute state school. It's going to be nice. It's going to be, leaves. I had no idea like the prestige or history of the school. So I went there for a summer, loved it. And then they gave me an opportunity to apply as a full-time student, and they would waive the application fee, which meant a lot because I was in a single parent home, did not have a lot of money. I paid for all my own college applications out of my part-time job. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, yeah, there's no application fee. Then the campus was full of lovely leaves. Sure. Like this would be great. So I applied, and I ended up getting in, and all the people in my program, actually the ones who did apply, did not get in. So it was actually very competitive.
Wow.
And I was the one person in the program who got into that school. And so, yeah, I just packed up all my stuff in 2 suitcases, essentially, everything I owned, including a printer and a comforter, because I'm a packing maven. I don't even know if I have that level now. I'm like, I don't even think I can pack like that now. But I had 2 suitcases, and I took a one-way flight from Ogden to Utah. And my church at the time raised the money to pay for
Wow.
my plane ticket because we couldn't afford to pay for the plane. So they like raised the money for me to go from Utah to New York. And so that's how I ended up, landing here essentially, was this kind of wild. It was really the gift of opportunity because I've said in my life, there's been people who have given me an opening and I've said yes. And
Hmm.
it's always changed my life. Like whether it was a school thing or an application, it's always someone saying, have you considered that? I think you would be good at that. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then I do it. So that's been a huge part of my story.
I love that. That is so cool. As you're as part of as you're working with leaders and helping coach them, how does well, the question, sorry, that is inarticulately trying to come out is not all workplaces are safe. Some are toxic, and
Mhm.
it's the leadership that's toxic. Sometimes it's the people that report to the leader that are toxic, and it's not safe to be vulnerable around. How are there ways that leaders that are listening to you now thinking, oh, I want to get the white paper, which is at thenewquo.com, that could start getting that self-awareness, that self-reflection, and start kind of practicing with stories without necessarily inadvertently opening themselves up to attacks from people that are gunning for them?
That's a really great question because I think there's
Thanks,
always
because I
this
think it
amount.
took forever to ask it, so thank you.
I think there is a lot of, justifiable fear around vulnerability. Brene Brown talks about shame and vulnerability in some great books. There's one called the Gifts of Imperfection, which is kind of, I guess, like a parent to the gift, the surprising gift of doubt. But she essentially talks about how vulnerability is incredibly important for a well-lived life, but you have to be selective in your vulnerability. So
Hmm.
it's sort of like putting marbles in a jar. You sort of test it out. You put one marble, two marble. You see if they can hold those marbles and they don't just break out and spill everywhere. And so I think a great test is being able to tell aspects of your story that you would share on social, like aspects of yourself and your life that are personal enough that feel like people can understand past the surface of like the weather's nice, like, right, you've got to share a bit more than that, but not so close to the chest that it can be used against
Hmm.
you. And there are lots of, you'd be surprised, there are a lot of stories people have that can be eye-opening and interesting and point to their identity and history that doesn't have to be like let your dirty laundry hang all out. Like there are aspects
Okay.
of my story that I don't talk about publicly, or certain family dynamics or certain people I've experienced that I may not ever tell publicly, but people still know aspects of my story in terms of living in Utah and some of my experiences and that sort of thing. I think also there's probably more people than not that you can see as a sort of a safe haven and make those connections with. Because I think once you make safe pockets, you're able sort of to take that energy and start to multiply it over time. Because when you
Huge.
act in a specific way, you mirror to other people that it's safe. So I think someone has to kind of take the initiative, and usually the leaders are the ones who set the culture. It's sort of like whatever the leaders sort of believe and buy into and share, they become the status quo. So if you are a leader, if you set some aspect of story sharing and understanding beyond the surface of what you have assumed about that person, and they see you doing that, it's mirrored back very easily. So an example of that is when I
Hmm.
used to work in the media world. I've worked in like 4 industries, so like my story is a lot of twists and turns. But when I was in the media world, I was running a team and I was doing content development and like sales strategy nationwide for this big media company. And my team, essentially, I started this process of a self reflection check in, essentially, where I was learning more about their careers and their life stories and wanting to know what they wanted to learn and what they wanted to grow in. And that process allowed them to trust me more, and they wanted to share more with me
Hmm.
because I had implemented that process kind of on for early on in terms of their actual development. So it wasn't just like, here's the goal, push the button in the cog, do it now. Like I wasn't having that kind of relationship with them. I wanted to understand them a bit deeper and understand who they were, what motivated them. And I always got feedback that they're like, this is like some of the best development experiences I've had. You're one of the best managers I've ever had. And I was like, hey, listen, I'm just doing the bare minimum. I'm like, that's also kind of sad to me. I
Right?
think I'm just doing the right thing. And it's not like I'm going above and beyond, but to them, they're like, I've never had this before.
That
So that
is
was also eye opening to me too, is you have to model what you want to see as well, especially as a leader.
one of the things I've seen in the pandemic is the simple things with Zoom, where I think it's maybe Susan Detweiler, who said, "What's your name? Where are you from? And what's something on your desk or in your reach that's giving you joy?" And it's interesting to see those kind of very safe personal stories, but it rehumanizes people and makes the whole meeting be on a different plane than it might have been. Are there ways that you've seen COVID, with all the horror that it is? Are there ways that you've seen leaders being able to test out some of the narrative intelligence and own their story with their teams?
The thing you just brought up around questions is such a powerful tool. I think one of the simplest, like put your toe in the pool kind of practices is good questions. And because the
Mm,
kinds of questions that you ask allow someone to pick aspects of their story and to share it, right? So even to asking someone what brings them joy reveals a lot about who they are.
hmm.
But most people don't ask that question. They're just like, how was your weekend? Fine. That's not an interesting question. So of course you're not going to get interesting information. And I think in COVID, people
Interesting.
started asking more compelling questions because they had to. It's weird to not ask about it when we're living through a pandemic and millions of people are dying. It's weird to be like, how's the weather? Yeah, of course. There's also a pandemic around. So like, how are you feeling? What's been going on? And
Hmm.
people had to be a lot more honest because their lives were completely disrupted in so many different ways. Some people had far more disruption than other people.
Yeah.
And I think that has forced people to be a bit more real, to be a bit more vulnerable, and to also see that, like, yeah, work is important, but there are lives on the line. And so sometimes our goals and whatever deadlines have to be paused while we are dealing with life. And that is
Yeah.
totally okay. I think teams that were much more understanding and flexible have had more success, and they've been able to keep people around because no one wants to stay with an employer that's like, oh, your grandma just died in the hospital. Oh, okay, that's cute. Yeah, can you get us that paper tomorrow? Like, no, I'm not going to get you that thing tomorrow. I have far more important things I am dealing with. And I've seen companies who are now finally, even like the work from home thing.
Mm.
I don't understand. It just proves a point that logistically, so many companies could have had far more stringent work from home policies, and they were forced into it now. And it's going to be hard to go back because people are like, listen, it's been a year and nothing, and we're fine.
Yeah.
In fact, we probably save money. We're more productive. People can spend more times with their family and friends because they're commuting less. It's just funny because there's going to be aspects of this that have forced companies to innovate before they wanted to, not because they didn't have the ability to.
Right.
And I think that's an important aspect of this is like seeing that change can actually occur kind of quickly if we have the ideological willingness. A lot of the time, it's not because there's such crazy insurmountable barriers, it's because there's an unwillingness. So I think that innovation has been happening at some really incredible levels. And we are still in it, so it's hard to say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But I think when we look back 10 years, from now or whatever time frame it may be, we will be able to see those shifts essentially.
One of the things that when you were saying that was I was just cringing because there was not because of you, but I've heard of managers that were so tied to butts in seat. Like if I can't see you, I don't know if you're working, that they would have
Mhm.
open Zoom during office hours. You had to keep your Zoom room open.
What?
Yeah. Yeah. And they were trying to micromanage the rooms behind them and all this other stuff as though we weren't living through a global pandemic. Right.
That is insane. I didn't even know. But it also points to this idea of, I think, as a leader, you have to understand how people operate. And if narrative intelligence is about psychology, because it's
Hmm.
like, what gets people to change their behavior? That's all narrative intelligence is. How does story affect behavior? And I think if you don't understand at a fundamental level what makes people happy when it comes to work, you are always going to be a bad manager. People want autonomy, they want ownership, they want creativity, and they want to be respected. And if you can't meet those basic minimums, they're not going to be happy no matter how much they're being paid. And no matter,
Hmm.
what fancy, keg you might have in the office. I think those fundamental emotional states are really important. That's why so many people are saying, you know what? I'm not going this traditional path. I refuse to put up with emotional abuse. I refuse to be put in an exploitative environment where I'm underpaid chronically. Like people are really putting their foot down because they're like, I have nothing to lose if I'm literally on, the edge essentially and sort of hanging on paycheck to paycheck. Why should I essentially sacrifice my mental well-being for an organization that's not loyal to me? And I think a lot of organizations are learning that traditional conventional practices are broken. We know that traditional leadership practices are dramatically inherently broken. That's why we're in
Yeah.
a pandemic to begin with. We've had
Great
poor
point.
leadership for a very long time and inequitable leadership for a long time. And so I'm excited to see a new paradigm of leadership. That's why I talk about narrative intelligence as this tool of personal transformation and organizational transformation, because I do think it starts at this ideological values level. And it's not just the prescriptive policies and practices that need to change.
I think that's excellent. I think that a lot of leaders get into leadership and just kind of do what they think other people have been doing and they try to copy it unreflectively. And so I love that you're causing them to go into self awareness and reflection because so much of what is management or scientific management or whatever is really just deeply embased in equity, and
Yeah.
dehumanizing work that or work practices that fortunately we're living at a time where people, like you said, they're going to walk. They're not going to stand for it. And I love that about the time we're in. It's forcing us to do the things that we should have been doing all along.
Yeah, and sometimes we are kind of a reactive species, right? We wait till things get to a point of no return, and we're like, maybe we should change this. I don't think it's gonna work.
Okay,
I'm
the
like,
pain is so much, maybe.
right, maybe we should change it. And I'm like, yeah, I think, with conventional business, what's funny about it is all of it's made up, right? We've made all these practices and policies, and so they can continue to change. I mean, child labor was a best practice, slavery was a best practice, and like, look at it now, like we don't do those things in certain ways anymore. So I'm like, it's just funny to me that none of this is permanent. So that's the exciting
Wow.
part is every single thing that you think is a fundamental principle, and when it comes to societal or social or organizational structure, can be changed and has changed. And I think what's exciting to me is for people to understand that the power rests within a small handful of people. Because as we've seen time and time again, it only takes a small group of like minded, focused individuals to shift something, to start a snowball effect. And so, even though it feels like I'm just one person, whatever you do in your personal life as a leader has incremental impacts that can essentially move things towards the better or move them to worse.
It's
And I
true.
think people have a lot more power to choose now than they ever did before.
Christina Blacken, thank you so much for being a guest with me. I want to encourage everybody to go to the New Quo, listen to her podcast back episodes, go through all the catalog. It's good. And get the white paper on narrative intelligence, because just like she was saying, there's a change happening and is possible. And we as individuals can be part of that and create a snowball. Thank you,
Thank you for
Christina.
having me, Mark.